The structural permanent decline in coal is a game changer for an industry that has traditionally relied upon coal for a significant portion of its volumes. What will the effect be on the rail industry, and what is the reaction to this change?
Certainly, when you look at efficiencies in the marketplace, everything's just become much more efficient. Your refrigerator, your appliances, a lot less manufacturing in this country, so a lot less electricity generation. Two is that gas has really occupied much of the demand that coal used to fill. Coal at one point in time, I think, was a high of 46% of fuel used. Then it got down to kind of 40, and it kind of stayed in that 40 for quite a while. And we've seen numbers down as low as 30% this year. Gas prices went way down, $1.50 million, and everybody that could convert from coal to gas did. It's interesting, now gas has come back up, and we're seeing it at the 315, 310 forward curves, 340, 350, 360, and people are burning more coal. And then the last piece of this puzzle, of course, is the regulatory apparatus that the EPA has been setting over these coal-fired utilities, and that has certainly been a real headwind for coal as well. A lot of uncertainty. Clean Power Act, as you know, was stayed at the Supreme Court. It's going to be litigated now. Whether or not that happens or not, I think is anybody's guess. A lot of it has to do with something called the presidential election. And so I think our question on coal is uncertain at best. For a long time, the industry was represented by coal being its largest single commodity at about 20% of units and about 25% of revenue. Big deal to the industry. I think you will see that go down to about 10%. And again, it's kind of logical. We're hauling about half as many tons, so you'll see it about half as much as a percent of total units hauled. That's really a really important number, and all railroads will be a little different. But when you start talking about taking, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of carloads of coal out of a single railroad network, it's really a big deal. And so you think about, as developing countries develop, what do they need? Affordable, reliable energy. What is that? That's going to be coal. So the world should expect that more and more coal is going to be mined. And the question is, who will enjoy the benefits of that? The coal in this country is actually much cleaner coal than what's being mined in Indonesia, what's being mined in China. And so we have this debate with the policymakers on that question. Net, aren't we much better off exporting our coal and allowing developing countries to burn that coal? And that's a subject that doesn't have let's say universal acceptance.
I've seen some studies, Matt, that say that the Powder River Basin has a limited lifespan, 20 years, maybe 15, 20 years before the coal becomes difficult or expensive to mine the deeper you go. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's a lot longer than that, Bill. And even today, when you look at FOB mine pricing for PRB, it's very efficient, very low cost compared to like Central Lab. It's still $12 to $15 in that range, and that's just incredibly low cost coal. And it's much easier to get it out of the ground, and I have to tell you, we have an efficient transportation network that's been built up over the decades that's provided an efficient way to move the stuff. You
mentioned the presidential election. We're not going to get into personalities here of either of them, but both of them are talking about the need for additional infrastructure investment at a much higher level than what we've seen typically. How would additional investment, from your perspective, and you're very close to what's going on here in Capitol Hill, how would that impact our industries and the railroads?
Yeah. The problem is that as we move away from the user pay system, where our biggest competitor, the trucking industry, every time they go to the gas pump, they're paying, and now all of a sudden you're getting more and more of that money into the infrastructure investment coming through things like general revenues or tax repatriation back into this country. I mean, as an aside, the last big bill that was passed, to their credit, they got a 5-year bill, but the way they paid for it was, quote, selling barrels out of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve at $80 a barrel. I mean, just think about that. Crude is nowhere close to $80 a barrel, but that's what they had to do to get the numbers to work. And so as our biggest competitor is, quote, subsidized, or if you start to see things like great expansions of truck size and weight without the trucking industry paying their appropriate use taxes, or you start to see a technological revolution in the trucking industry, i.e. automated vehicles, and you don't allow the railroads to accomplish those same types of technological advances. I mean, everybody yesterday see the USA Today, the truck that went 200 miles full of beer with the truck driver in the back in the sleeper berth. So those are things that...
Was he drinking?
Hopefully not. But those are things that distort the balance of how this industry works. And it's really hard to get this point across. But it's real simple. If the country wants more tons to go to the railroad, then we need to enact pro-tax, pro-regulatory initiatives that incentivize that. If we want more tons to go to the highway, we need to do just the opposite. So we don't accept a lot of federal funding in our current model, like less than 1%. And so up here they don't appropriate our funds, but they actually appropriate our ability to compete and our profitability through things like the STB, through things like the EPA, through things like how they're going to pay for the highway system, through things like Department of Labor on things like productivity and all those things. So I know it's a hard subject, but if everybody will just step back and say, do we want more trucks on the highway, then we will take certain approaches to the way that we pay for and regulate this industry. If we want less trucks on the highway, we'll do other things.
Let's move on from funding to permitting. Now, BNSF has been dealing with some pretty serious permitting issues in the Pacific Northwest, port areas and things like that. Permitting is often turning out to be a greater challenge for private sector investment in new infrastructure. Permitting reform, there's a need for it. Does either presidential candidate understand this challenge, especially in the impact on the supply chain's ability to move energy-related commodities?
The NEPA permitting process has turned out to be a way for progress to be stopped. And even the environmentalists that I talked to about this they never intended for this to happen that way. But that's really what's happening, that when you don't like a project, you drag it down through the process. So countries like Canada have put a shot clock on their permitting time frame. It's interesting, back in the Great Recession, the greatest recession since the Great Depression, Governor Mark Dayton had a couple of mills that were trying to be built and directed his agencies in the state of Minnesota to expedite these permits. They were built. Some of it was built with some assistance of government money. Jobs were created. When the I-35 bridge went down in Minnesota, permitting was expedited. Bridge was built in 1 year. Okay. Now compare that to, what typically happens when you add $1 to a federal highway project. It can elongate it out for 8, 10, 12 years. We've been tussling with a project down in Los Angeles, what we call a near dock project, that would take millions of truck miles off the 710 highway, right? Sounds so logical. right? I mean, we're going to reduce carbon, reduce congestion by taking all these truck miles off the 710. We got caught up in a local permitting issue. It was 9 years before we got a draft EIR. We finally got it. The day we got it, the next day we had 9 different groups, including the city of Long Beach, sue us. We lost the case. We're into it now for $60 million, year 10, and we got a lawsuit on our hands. And so when we think about, the LA Long Beach competitiveness, I mean, again, it's a whole series of people that have to weigh in on this. But if you want more port jobs, you have to have more port capacity. If you don't want more port jobs, then you don't want more port capacity, and this may be a way to kill that. But there's so much economic drip that comes off that port, and they are literally hamstringing their ability to be efficient and effective. It's all going to come back to our community of Americans in total deciding, has the balance shifted too far, or do we really want to continue to be able to grow as a country and reduce our dependence on other countries that aren't always favorable to us? And are there these things called projects of national significance that, for the good of the country, just like when the interstate highway system was built, for the good of the nation, we needed that network, and what a gift that's been to us. But we as a country right now have a very dim view of talking about things for the good of the nation, because it's coming back to, not in my backyard, or no, I don't want it to be developed because I don't like that flavor of that.
We are still a heavily regulated industry, even though we were quote unquote deregulated in 1980. What concerns you the most about the current rail regulatory process, and how that impacts our industry's ability to invest?
I'll go back when I started in leadership at BNSF in 2000. Our return on invested capital was about 5.5%, and wasn't good at all. And so during that next 15 years, our returns grew up to about 13.5% 2 years ago. During that same 15 years, we've spent about $55 billion. It's amazing. $55 billion of investment. And so there's been this question, and rightly so, because certain customer groups, certain commodities feel like they've been disadvantaged by the regulatory apparatus that was put in place in 1980.
When you say $55 billion, you're talking about BNSF.
BNSF only.
Okay, the industry is, of course,
Yeah.
$500 billion since deregulation.
No, I'm talking about in my 15
Just
years.
in your 15 years.
$55 billion. It's a big number. And so when the industry, there's certain customers, and I don't at all pretend that this hasn't happened. There's certain customers that feel like they've kind of been left behind in the regulatory apparatus, that it doesn't work for them, and I get that. But overall, when we think about going back to 1980, you had about a third of the rail miles that were technically in bankruptcy or insolvency. The whole world was moving to trucks, moving to the highway. And Jimmy Carter, bless his heart, signed the act, deregulated, and kind of left the railroads and said, let the industry, you guys go figure it out. And figure it out we did. We had tremendous productivity because we were allowed to. We weren't hamstrung by the federal government. We created through a collective bargaining process, crew consist reform. We started implementing technology that created tremendous productivity. And without the government having to put any more money, and I say any more because back in the day when they did bail out Conrail, they actually, in today's dollars, spent more money on bailing out Conrail than they spent on the General Motors and Chrysler bailout in today's dollars. So the federal government put no more money into the railroad industry. They allowed for all of these market forces between labor and management and customers and all this stuff to all work itself out through the natural market mechanisms. And you look at it today, we have the world's best freight railroad network that's just unimaginable to most countries. And anybody, you guys have traveled, you go out and you see, you go out and see the world, and everybody talks about their passenger rail network, and I grant you, ours is not to that same level. But when it comes to freight rail, nobody does freight rail like this country does. And it's been done without government money, generally. And so the regulatory apparatus, I would say, has worked. Again, not for everybody. I get it. There's problems with it. I don't know if peak returns are over, but in this current business cycle, returns are coming down. They're coming down a couple of hundred basis points, which is exactly what I thought would happen, exactly what normal business cycles would happen. Meanwhile, we have our agency, who I have great respect for. They've been looking in the rearview mirror, seeing all these peak volumes, peak returns, peak pricing, everything else, and they've opened up a plethora of proceedings. 12 of them, to be exact, which literally goes after every portion of the regulatory doctrine that has been put into this industry. And I think when you look at them, this cumulative impact of all these proceedings will have a devastating blow to the railroad industry. And again, I think it's just the opposite of what policymakers will want. I don't think that policymakers will want, at the end of the day, for railroads to spend a lot less and go back to the level of investment we had in 2000, 2001. I think policymakers up here, I think people generally want railroads to continue to invest, to take more trucks off the highway, to get more carbon out of the environment. And yet, you can't look at each one of these rulemakings just individually. You have to look at the cumulative impact. And at the end of the day, whenever I'm dealing with, whether it's the administration or a senator or a member of Congress or one of the STB regulators, I always ask them the question. You should have to answer the question, by my actions in this change of this regulatory decision, will it create less capacity, less capital for the railroads to invest? And it's not to say that there shouldn't be checks and balances. There are already checks and balances of the railroad industry. There is rate methodology. There's rate cases. We lost a $325 million rate case 7 years ago. So there are abilities. Should the processes be improved? Absolutely. Should there be some ways to streamline to where customers don't have to spend 8 years or 5 years at the agency to litigate or prosecute a case? Absolutely. But should we just wholesale reinvent the entire industry that's really has found its footing for our customers? It's amazing when we get out of Washington, D.C., and we get away from the politicalness of rail regulatory issues, we get away from the STB in this town, we get out to the country, to our customers who are having to produce something to ship it so that their employees can remain in business. They want us to make money. Now, of course, they want it to be a fair and reasonable return. And so I think it's a very legitimate question. Are the returns over this business cycle, let's just take my career of leadership of 15 years, are they fair and reasonable? Are they gouging? Are they excessive? And I think anybody looks at the numbers, given the capital that we put in, it will be universally agreed by the vast majority of the community. No, they're not. For the investment we've made, these have been very reasonable returns. So I'm worried right now of the cumulative impact of all this stuff, and we've got good regulators. They're very capable people, but they're going to have to also understand that you can't just look in the rearview mirror. You got to look at current day. You got to look at an industry that's got 3,000 locomotives in storage, an industry that's got 50,000 freight cars in storage, an industry that's got 6,000, 7,000 employees furloughed. It's a business cycle that, none of us really like. It's just the reality. It's the reality of what's happened with the commodity super cycle. It's the reality of what's going on with demographics in this country. And wherever this thing levels out, this industry is going to be in much better shape, except for any significant change by the regulatory agency. We're going to be in much better shape than where we were in 2007 recession. We're going to be in much better shape than when we were in 1999 recession, and certainly in 1990 recession. We're a much stronger industry. Our safety stats reflect this enormous capital investment that has gone into these physical plants to make a much safer railroad. I mean, I know there's going to be a question on crude by rail. I love to talk about that. December 31st, New Year's Eve, 1999, first crude oil train in recent history, because we used to haul crude oil for Rockefeller back, 100 years ago. But in recent times, we've hauled 1.4 million units of crude oil, and we've had 38 failures in this country. That's 99.997% incident free. Now, I've been to locations where we've had incidents. I get it, but it's been an incredibly safe way to provide this country with a lot of choices when we think about where we're going to open up the next foreign policy front.
Class 1 consolidation. Do you see that as a dangerous road that may lead to legislation on open access?
I don't think our customers outside of, a lot of the trucking industry, customers really want us to merge. They're concerned about market power already. I think there's a populism that's out there, specifically in this town, that thinks that bigger is worse. I don't share that. I see it sometimes, but I don't share it in the case of that. But I don't think that there's going to be a period where we're going to go into two railroads, except for if the regulatory agency prompts us to do it.
Driverless technology, can it be adopted to locomotives, and what effect does that have on PTC?
PTC is an evolution. Moving block, where we would take the signals out of the ground, is the next step in that. Driver assist technology is already being implemented today through fuel management programs, things like that.
Right.
When we put PTC in, that's the ultimate driver assist that will prevent a collision between two trains. It's just, I don't see there's any way to stop technology, and I don't think there's any reason we want to. Humans are a cause of accidents. When we look at all the accidents in the trucking industry or the airline business or the railroad business, human cause continues to come back as the number one issue. And so we as society should want to continue to eliminate that risk. And the technology is coming. It's going to be there. You see it in your cars already, and you see it in this beer truck that rolled down the highway the other day. I don't think that people should think about this technology as being 20 years out. I don't think it's next year, but I really do think in 5 to 7 years you will see it. The Department of Transportation put $5 billion into their budget recommendation to build out the infrastructure for driverless cars and trucks on the nation's highway system. And so the railroad industry's got to continue to reinvent themselves and to look at those things. And anything that gets in the way of that, again, is just going to put more trucks back on the highway, which I don't think anybody wants to do. I think the industry has an enormously bright future. And I think that there's going to be tremendous opportunity for growth. We've got a demographic issue in our own railroad industry. I see it every month on our railroad, where we're losing the talent we're losing that's retiring after 30, 40 years of service. And we've been hiring over the past 15 years since I've been in leadership, enormous amounts of new people to come into the industry. And we're still not to the point where we're going to have enough to replace the talent that's leaving the business. And so what I would tell you, what I tell every new employer, I did up until 2 years ago when I was CEO, I'd meet with every new employee and I'd tell them, you know, if you really want to be in this railroad industry, we would always be in Fort Worth, Texas when I'd make this little speech. You know, it's interesting, this is a beautiful place, you got nice art on the walls, et cetera, but the railroads run out in the field. And the more you learn about the operations, the more you learn about track maintenance, the more you learn about mechanical, the more valuable your career is going to be. And I still go through development of every one of our departments, of resource development of every one of our departments. We had on Monday a planning talent deep dive with our operating team. And, you know, when I look at our engineering department, Steve Anderson runs it. You know, it's a $4 billion budget, including capital. And, you know, he's taking me through these traditionally younger people and showing me, you know, degreed engineer, come out of A&M, came through the management training program. They're 8 years into their career now. We've had them in 6 different jobs. They've done assistant roadmaster, been on a gang, put them over here in development, in transportation, became a GDT, bringing them back to engineering. I mean, it's just, the talent is going to be so much better qualified, educated, technologically savvy than the talent of people that came in the industry was when it was my age. And it's an incredibly great time for your career to be in this industry.
Well, Matt, thank you very much. Give him a hand. All right.